Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Agnes, and I'm a senior marketing specialist at Inform Consult, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this joint webinar hosted by ProvisionPoint and Inform Consult. So today we'll be exploring the critical role of proactive risk management and governance in the digital workspace, with a particular focus on Microsoft 365. Our session will highlight how AI technologies are transforming governance processes into automated intelligence workflows and chance compliance, security, and operational efficiency. We are joined by two fantastic speakers today, Richard Jeffrey Cook, Head of Records Management and Consultancy at Inform Consult, and Peter Budley, Director of Sales and Client Solutions at ProvisionPoint, the information governance framework. And Peter will showcase ProvisionPoint's automation capabilities in a live demonstration. At the end of sessions, we'll open the floor to Q&A where Peter and Richard will answer your questions. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat through the webinar. Let's get started. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Jeffrey Cook, Head of Information and Records Management at Inform Consult. I'll take you through the first part of this webinar, looking at where information management is heading, artificial intelligence and how that affects information management, and focusing on the benefits and requirements of a governance framework to exploit the benefits of artificial intelligence. Inform Consult Limited, as you probably know, we're independent information management consultants helping businesses to transform their enterprise-wide information into a business asset. We provide a range of services in the information and records management, information governance space, providing bespoke consultancy services, which we deliver with our industry-leading consulting team. So, where is information management heading? So at the moment, everything seems to be talking about artificial intelligence, and that's very much the buzz that we are seeing at the moment in all forms of information technology, and information management is no exception to this. However, the challenges that information management professionals and organisations face really haven't changed actually over the last 25 years or so, where I've been focusing much of my efforts professionally during that period. So we continue to generate more and more information, and the volumes of that information just seems to increase year on year. What we sadly see is much of what is actually generated by organisations is actually stored incredibly inefficiently and is often very poorly controlled. And that leads to risks that we see essentially resulting in poor security. And almost on a sort of weekly basis, we hear stories of data breaches, most of which, to be blunt, are preventable if information security practices were substantial and better. We see too often that its failings lead to personal data being breached or organisations actually having their confidential information breached as well. And the threats from cybersecurity, fraud and so on just continue to be greater. We also see risks both in two ways. One, from information that doesn't need to be retained being retained for far too long, and that is not efficient in terms of storage, but also it prevents the valuable information from being readily accessible because it's obscured by all this less valuable information, the redundant, the obsolete, the trivial information that we see too often. But it also works the other way in that as well as deleting information that should be retained, those problems have not gone away either. So sometimes we need to delete information when it shouldn't be retained. Other times we need to make sure we're retaining information that hasn't been deleted. And those two conflicting requirements mean that we need to actually understand our information and decide what the appropriate policies that should be put in place are. How does this relate to AI? Well, pretty much all artificial intelligence solutions actually require information to train on. There's no magic silver bullet with artificial intelligence. It can't magically apply policies if it doesn't know the basis on which to apply those policies, and that's where you need to train your system. And the problem, like in real life, is that a little knowledge can actually be a very dangerous thing. And we'll cover some of the dangers later on in this presentation. So essentially, to require the basis to train our artificial classification systems that allow us to apply these policies effectively, we need a good classification framework. And along with that, we need actually good sample information that has been correctly classified. And we need quite a lot of it to provide a proper basis to really take advantage of these agents and these AI tools that are becoming available. And this has been a long time coming as well. It's not something that's happened overnight, but it's actually taken quite a long time for the tools to actually be effective enough to actually be used and become cheap enough to be used in a wide ranging information technology environment. So what are the components we need to have an effective framework in order to take advantage of these tools? One of the things we actively promote at Inform Consult is the idea of an information governance framework, and that's to control our organisational information. And by control, it's ensuring it has the appropriate policies, both security policies, access control policies, but also retention and deletion policies as well. And that has to be tied into the roles that exist within the organisation and the responsibilities for managing information, the processes that actually use this information and take advantage of them, and the security controls and the measures that are put in place to manage the information effectively through its entire life cycle. And the life cycle is really from the capture or the creation of the information. So capture is information that's generated externally and brought into the organisation. Creation of the information would happen internally. Then the storage of that information, and through that the application of our classification, and then eventually towards the end of the life cycle, it's retention for archiving or disposition of the information that we need to cover as well. And at the heart of this is what we would describe as our information architecture, the approach we have to organising, structuring, labelling, searching and navigating all the content in an effective way, but also in a sustainable way, because this is not something that's going to go away. It's not something we do just once and then we've solved the problem, that's it. It's something that we have to continue to do over the long term. And that's in itself introduces a whole range of challenges, because while it's easy to organise information once, actually to keep the framework up to date and being effectively applied, and that involves things like training staff and continuing to train staff. So it needs to be sustainable. It's also going to be something that's readily understood by staff throughout the organisation. And along with the classification, we also need to have the appropriate metadata, or information about our information, that will support the application of those policies and supports things like searching as well. Along with that, we also need to understand our information assets and manage them effectively. Basically, a fundamental rule is if you don't know what you've got, you cannot manage it effectively. So this covers things like where and how the information is stored, as well as what security policies apply to it and our retention and disposal schedules. But how can it go wrong if we don't have these things in place? Well, again, if we don't have our asset management, understand what information we have, we can't possibly provide sample data to train our AI tools that is comprehensive and where the information has been classified correctly. Obviously, you can't create an information classification out of nothing. You have to have done the work to understand how you want to apply your schedules and your access rules before you can actually ensure that the tool is picking up the appropriate rules. So when this can go wrong, it can be quite disastrous. And we've seen just purely through search tools, not even AI tools specifically, that information that is released when, quite frankly, it shouldn't have been. And we've had examples of organizations where, for example, they inadvertently released the plans to close some of their factories when those were actually still to be released. And so the first staff knew about these potential closures was when the information was inadvertently made available because of the incorrect application of access controls. So one of the big dangers, particularly once you get into artificial intelligence tools, is that they may have access to information that shouldn't be shared. And the incorrect application of this security can result in information which, in theory, could have been accessed anyway, but because it was buried within the storage systems, perhaps wasn't necessarily visible. Suddenly, with these greater tools, that information may actually be either directly released or actually in influencing the results from the tools themselves. So these are big dangers that we get with these AI systems. So how do we address this? Well, this is through our governance and risk and compliance framework. So the framework overall is coordinating the strategy, rules, the processes, and our policies all together. And along with that, we can combine enterprise risk management approaches, measure, monitor, and mitigate our risks. The big challenge still with the ERM, enterprise risk management, is actually assessing the risks effectively. A good example actually highlighted by the British Library breach at the end of last year is actually that they had a lot of small risks, and what they failed to do was actually identify that the combination of all the small risks together actually constituted a whopping great big risk. And unfortunately, when they had their security breach, it led to their inability to access all their service systems, and that caused disruption for many months. And in fact, the library is still only in the early stages of recovering all the systems that were affected and impacted by this security breach. And once we got the framework in place, we need compliance to ensure that we're monitoring the changing regulations and standards and that we meet and comply with these requirements so that we're operating efficiently as well as safely and legally. And that involves managing the entire information estate and continuing to adapt to the change wherever it originates from. So I hope that's given you some ideas of the impact we're seeing of artificial intelligence in the information management environment. And I'll now hand over to Peter, who will talk about Microsoft 365 governance in action.
Great. Thank you, Richard. And thank you for everyone attending today. And that's a really great introduction to the sort of governance frameworks which need to be put in place. As Richard said, I'm going to focus primarily on Microsoft 365 and the ProvisionPoint tools and how we support governance and with a relevance to AI. So if we move to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about ProvisionPoint and then I'll move into my main presentation. So ProvisionPoint itself, we are solely focused on governance. We're a solution for Microsoft 365. We're about empowering self-service governance, so empowering users to manage those workspaces in the Microsoft environment effectively. So we support SharePoint sites, Microsoft Teams, Viva Engage communities, Microsoft 365 groups, and Planner plans. And we support the life cycle of those objects. So that includes provisioning, lifecycle management, compliance, and audit to give administrators the tools they need, but still empower self-service with certain controls around that. So that's us as an organization. Let's move on to what we're actually going to talk about today. So if we can move to the next slide, Richard. And before I talk in more detail about ProvisionPoint, Richard's obviously talking a lot about governance frameworks and AI more generally. Just to, perhaps one of the most common conversations I have nowadays with IT leaders, compliance managers, information managers is our Microsoft 365 environment ready for AI? Organization leaders are pushing them to deploy AI technologies for the risk of falling behind and the need to do that very quickly and at speed. But a lot of organizations just aren't ready for it technically from a Microsoft 365 perspective. Some of the common problems and perhaps the two biggest issues at the moment, firstly is data sprawl. I've seen so many organizations where they've just in the last 12 to 18 months moved their network drives en masse to Microsoft 365. They see that as the best way to enable hybrid working with people working home and partially in the office now. Their network drives and trying to connect to them is too complicated for those hybrid workers. Microsoft 365 is much more accessible. Challenge is if you've dumped all of that data, there's a lot of old data, there's lots of potentially personal or confidential data which the security about hasn't been fully considered, and potentially some of the permissions which you've put in place on network drives hasn't been reviewed for a long time or isn't necessarily carried across during the migration to the cloud. Generally, everyone universally is pretty bad at tidying up their data, and it's exactly the same for Microsoft 365. No one consciously goes and archives their data, or maybe a few of us do, but most people don't. Most people don't go and archive an old site with old pricing information or old financial documents or old contractual documents or old policies. What's the cost of the organization of AI finding an old policy and giving a user guidance on using that out-of-date information? That could lead to a commercial incident or even something much more serious. And rarely organizations have deployed retention policies in Microsoft 365 to retain and then dispose of data appropriately and in a compliant way. So data sprawl is the first big challenge. And the second big challenge generally with Microsoft 365, but also is holding up successful deployment of AI, is security and a lack of consistent approach to it. There's a lot of instances of orphaned information in the Microsoft environment. So that's when someone comes and creates a team and then a year later they leave the organization. No one's locking down that data effectively. No one's closing off access, which should no longer be required, so that there's no one there to manage that team anymore. There's often an incorrect sharing of data. Sharing links are great because they stop individual files being emailed around. Not all organizations adopt sharing links, so there's still those emails in individuals' mailboxes or OneDrives or copied everywhere. And then when they have deployed sharing links, they're not regularly reviewed so that they're closed down as part of a regular security review if no longer relevant. And Copilot can pick up those inaccuracies in sharing of information, which are maybe not immediately visible to users day to day and administrators day to day. And deployment of sensitivity labels out of purview is often inconsistent within organizations. And these are one of the best ways of tagging confidential and personal information, but you can then enforce a lot of policies around it and start to actually use some of the intelligence of the platform to even automatically tag information. Again, when we're starting to introduce AI, how can we make sure that we identify that data which it's not appropriate for it to manage? So that's some of the things which we have to consider when we're looking at the Microsoft 365 environment from an AI perspective and from a governance perspective. How does ProvisionPoint help? So let's have a look at on the next slide, the key areas. So I talked in the introduction about the different core areas, but from a governance perspective, the 3 key areas I'm going to look at today, and I'll briefly talk about them, and then I'll move into a short demonstration. Firstly is audit. So being able to audit your environment. There's a lot of demand at the moment for AI readiness audits, preparedness for AI. Our audit reports allow you to quickly understand risks in how your information is secured, classified and stored. So firstly, I'll show you some of our audit reports capabilities for initial discovery of risks around AI, but also for ongoing reporting purposes. We'll then look at the lifecycle side to help clean up that data sprawl, identify content which should be archived and follow a multi-step process to archive that data and dispose of it appropriately. And then finally, we'll talk about compliance and how we can proactively ensure that our data is correctly managed and secured throughout the life cycle of using tools like AI. It's great that we tidy up an environment, but if we don't maintain it correctly, then we'll start to produce those incorrect or high risk results from using AI. So let's have a look at each of those individually, starting with audit. So our audit reports allow us to regularly audit our environment to make sure it's correctly secured. So we have reports looking at sharing of information, which may be incorrect, understanding storage of data, understanding orphaned objects, and we allow you to do this across your Microsoft 365 environment efficiently with the option to take actions, doing the sorts of reports which it can take days or even weeks to produce manually or with scripting. Next, we have the lifecycle components. So that's policies and configurable policies to manage multi-stage disposal of those key collaboration objects like sites and teams within your environment. So to clean up old data, sites and teams which are no longer being used, actually proactively go and archive those with the options to engage the owners of that data in the process to say whether they still need to retain it, and making sure it's locked down and no longer visible to AI technologies. And then finally, we have our compliance policies. So this is about ongoing compliance of your environment. Once you've got those core rules in place and you've tidied up your environment, our compliance policies allow you to proactively monitor them. Look for things like disabled users who are managing sites and teams but are no longer part of the organization. Looking for incorrectly or unlabeled information, looking for incorrectly shared and classified information. The compliance reports can identify these risks and even proactively address those. So those are the 3 core areas today. I'm going to take over screen sharing for a minute and I will show you my demonstration today. Richard, can you confirm that you can see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. It's always good to have someone just to check that with me so I'm not presenting and no one can see anything. So as I said, I'll start with audit reports. So our audit app currently is available to administrators, but will also shortly be rolling out to team owners in a more restricted way. And it has a range of different reports available. Currently, we can report on guest users in our environment, sharing links, storage, and also orphaned objects, with more reports to come looking at different types of risks at different areas within our Microsoft environment. Why is this important? Because in a setup on considering AI, we need to quickly understand our tenant and make sure that our tenant is healthy and there's not potential risks for us. So let's have a couple of ones to have a quick look at. Sharing links. Many organizations extensively use sharing links, but it can be tricky to actually go and audit them and understand if there are any incorrectly shared information. The audit app includes a report which allows us to view and audit all of the sharing links within either a specific site or team or in a specific across your whole tenant. So here the sharing links report shows me all of the links which have been shared within my environment. It can see who shared them, when they were shared on, what permissions were granted, and who was invited, and if those people were invited externally. This is really powerful for administrators to quickly review my environment and understand any shared information which is not correct and take action on that, maybe dispose some of those sharing links which are incorrect. I recently looked at delivering a similar report in PowerShell. It took me 2 days to build a similar report in PowerShell and then another 2 days to actually run it. This is much more efficient. If I go and have a look at one of our other reports, so we can also run reports across storage within our environment. So for example, we might want to identify any storage, which is any sites or teams which are using up a lot of storage. That might indicate a specific area we need to go and tidy up, clean up. There's probably some data to archive in there. So here I've got a particular team which has a lot more data in it than the rest of them. That might indicate that I need to go and investigate that further. We can also drill down into an individual site or team and do more detailed analysis of what areas are using up that storage. We can also look at orphaned objects. So these are where users have left the organization, but there's still potentially permissions available to them, or those user accounts haven't been tidied up. Again, an important element of preparing for AI is ensuring those redundant objects are cleaned up. So for example, here we can run a report and look at orphaned users within my environment. It can flag those, and then I can actually select a specific one and I can proactively choose to remove that user from that individual site or from multiple sites as part of my request there. These actions are all audited as well, so it's a great way of generating and understanding my environment. I should have also said, for any of my reports which I have, I can also export those out to Excel. So if I'm producing a physical report which I need to share with other people, I can export these and deliver those to key management as part of that compliance report which I'm doing. So that's audit. Second is lifecycle. So ProvisionPoint also proactively manages all of your sites and teams. You see here I've got a number of different sites and teams which are being managed within my environment. Let's go and have a look at a couple of these to see how they're being actively managed. So here I've got one here called the IT Change Project. You'll immediately notice that it has an expiry process going on there. So it's actually got 17 days left before it expires. The policies can be configured to send notifications to the owners. As that's coming up for expiry, the owners can come to the ProvisionPoint app and choose to extend that lifecycle period for a longer period of time. Each of those actions will be recorded within the timeline, so we can see that that action has been completed. And I'll show you an example of one where I recently did that. So here we can see that we've actually got a full 90-day lifecycle period attached to that. And that's because I recently, just today, extended that lifecycle period back to 90 days. So we can engage the owners as part of that lifecycle process, and we can also record that. The policy itself is made up of multiple stages, it being created, reminder notifications sent to key owners saying, do you still need this workspace? And even additional notifications so we can configure the schedule of that. And if it's not extended, then it would have gone ahead and archived it. I've actually extended it so I can see now it's going to be archived in February and it's going to be deleted in March again, unless it's extended. So this gives me a great audit of the life cycle of this workspace and the fact that someone's extended it. The policy itself is configurable. So as an administrator, I'm an administrator in this environment, I can go in and look and configure my policies. So I can go and define a policy. This can be on your existing sites and teams as well as new ones. And I can manage multi-stages. I can configure different rules around when my policy should be triggered. So it can be based on a time period, such as every 3 months, or it could be based on activity. And I'll show you that in a second if you just park that thought. The policy itself can have multiple stages. So here you can see at the point of expiry, it's going to go ahead and archive the site and team. 30 days out after that, it's going to delete it. Here I can go and define that period for shorter or longer. So I can say, well, actually, I want it to wait 45 days before it moves to the next stage. I can also configure reminder notifications to notify those key owners that they need to decide whether they want to extend it, and I can define the schedule of that. All the notifications are customizable. I can add additional stages here as well. So for instance, I could set the workspace to be read-only. I could stop sharing it. If you're using a backup solution within your environment, we could call to that backup solution and take a copy of your data set to offline and then go ahead and delete that workspace. So it's very configurable as part of the lifecycle policy. We can also manage events to control that trigger in different ways. So I said the trigger can be time-based, but it can also be activity-based. So here you can see I've got an activity check to say, has my site been modified in the last 30 days, or has my site been accessed in the past 15 days? If either of those two things are true, then it would automatically go and extend the lifecycle policy and it wouldn't trigger that expiry process. If no one had actively modified my site or accessed my site, and I can get more granular there, I could say as at least if 2 unique people have accessed my site, go and extend that period. Then it would then trigger that expiry process. So very configurable time-based or activity-based policies. So that allows us to tidy up our environment, archive, dispose of areas of Microsoft 365 not being used. Finally, we have our compliance policies. So our compliance policies check for risks in our environment. Let's just show you a couple which I've already got configured. So here I've got one which checks for orphaned sites and teams. So sites and teams with disabled owners who have left the organization. Again, a key risk because those people are not proactively managing their sites and teams anymore. They're probably not maintaining the security. They're not cleaning them up. They're not involved in the archive process. We need to replace those, or at least let the other owners and administrators know. So ProvisionPoint can report, notify, or take action based on what it finds. Another good example of that is guest users. So here it can identify external users who are no longer in my environment, and I can shut those down. I don't want them actively involved or have access to my environment anymore. We can also configure additional policies. One of my ones which I really like here is I can go in and define one for labeling. And I can go in here and say, I want to configure that. And then when I click on create, I can then go and define the rules associated with it. So one of the ones which I could configure is I can look for sensitivity labels. And I can say, well, show me any sites and teams which are classified with these labels are fine. But any which are classified maybe with the confidential label or not classified at all, I want the policy to identify and either notify someone or reclassify them accordingly. Again, if we've got incorrectly classified information, that could potentially pose a risk to AI. How do we actually use these reports effectively and these policies effectively? Well, I can actually go in and monitor my reports as an administrator. So as well as notifying people, I can go in and look at the recent policy runs. I can go and see which ones are compliant. Blue is good. Gray potentially represents a problem. So here I can go and identify. I've run this against 7 sites and teams in my environment, and you can have different policies for different parts of your environment. So it's not a one size fits all. I can drill in and see the detail. I can see which were compliant, which were not compliant. I can export those, and I can also go and look in one more detail. So I can see in this case, it's non-compliant. Nesta has left the organization. It should be replaced. I can also go in and see more about this workspace. This workspace is not being effectively managed, so I need to go and take some further action on this. I can see it's going to be archived in 10 days. So in 10 days, that might be what we need to do with this workspace. It's failed all of its recent compliance checks. So as an administrator, I'm concerned about this, and I can go and take some action, maybe assign new owners or bring forward the archiving sooner and make sure that that data is disposed of because it's just not meeting our rules anymore. Finally, ProvisionPoint allows me to get a great summary of my environment. So all of these policies and rules which we've got in place can be summarized as part of our dashboards. We can see the breakdown of our environment by different workspace types. We can see how it's classified, where there are sensitivity labels, also where there are no sensitivity labels, and I can even export those to take further action. I can also view my life cycle and see when those workspaces are going to expire. So a great way of helping me get a good understanding of my environment as part of an overall approach to governance. So that's ProvisionPoint. We have audit reports to help you get control and ongoing understanding those risks around how information is being shared. Secondly, lifecycle to control that sprawl and dispose of information. Thirdly, the compliance capabilities to proactively monitor and keep control and keep your environment in the right shape to be using tools like AI. With that, I'll hand back to Richard, and I think it's time for any questions. Or possibly to Agnes.
So now's the chance, if you've got any burning questions, to ask them. So Agnes, have we had anything pop up so far?
I think one of the questions was, who do you find most often takes charge of provisioning SharePoint sites? Is it an information management or governance team, IT, or another group such as legal or finance? So maybe we can address that question.
Yeah, in terms of the provisioning, generally organizations prefer that to be a self-service activity because they don't want to overload IT resources, but the management of that process, as well as using and leveraging all the policies which I showed in my demonstration today, typically falls on a governance or compliance team or an information management team rather than IT, or that's certainly the better option. Not all organizations have that team in place, but I think it's important to say that what we discussed today is not solely an IT problem, and organizations should be trying to manage this from a governance and information management perspective rather than seeing this as something which IT need to be dealing with. It's a different team and a different set of resources, certainly from the experience I've seen.
If I just add, I think in my experience, the responsibilities have fallen on a whole range of different teams in different organizations. I think the important thing is actually that there is a framework which makes it clear where the responsibilities lie. And in applying this technology, I think as long as those responsibilities are clear, then it doesn't matter too much where they actually lie. The problems come when the responsibilities are not clearly defined, and that causes far greater problems in my experience.
I had another question. So, Peter, with organizations that have deployed ProvisionPoint, what's the thing that has surprised them most that they didn't expect?
I think and this might sound like a strange answer, but I think it's bringing greater visibility to the owners of information within Microsoft 365. You would think that people know what they've created and what they've managed, but often they don't. And so the idea of actually delivering a greater degree of visibility to the owners of information and actually saying, this is something which you're responsible for. Do you still need it? Is it correctly classified? Is the security correct? Is actually really important, because often people will go, actually, I don't know why we've still got this information. It's out of date. It needs to be archived. So visibility and accountability for that information is perhaps the one thing which I hear most times being most impactful to organizations.
Thank you, Peter.
One of the things I often get asked is from organizations where they've already migrated to SharePoint, but they haven't applied labels or classifications in any consistent fashion, and what can they do about it? And I think this is the great thing and great opportunity that these AI tools actually provide for, because it's not a complete magic silver bullet, but you can start with these tools to actually take an area, analyze the information, create your classification framework, train it up on a sample set of data, and then test it out on a wider range of data, see what the results are, apply corrections to your framework or the training material, and then the tool itself will actually learn and apply those, so you can extend the classification to a wider area. And you don't have to do that all in one big bang. You can start with one area of your SharePoint system and then gradually extend it to other areas. So you might have some areas, and this is typical of most organizations, which are relatively well organized. So you can start applying the rules consistently with your tools or agents in those areas, and then extend it over time to cover more and more areas. And I think that that's one of the huge potential advantages of where we're heading with all this artificial intelligence. The basis that you don't have to manually do everything. You just have to start with a good sample set, and then the tools can take it forward from there.
I think we don't have any questions. Any additional reflections, Peter, Richard, you would like to add and share with the audience today?
I think the only other thing which we sometimes get asked is about how long this takes to do. And my answer I always say is there's a lot more work in terms of planning it. If you don't have a good information architecture, if you don't have good compliance rules in place and policies which you want to manage it, the time is about planning it and defining those rules effectively to ensure that the implementation is the most successful. So it's tricky to always put a time estimate on it, but I always say to organizations, don't underestimate the amount of work required in the planning of this.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that this is not a problem that will go away. So it's got to be addressed, and it's taking steps to avoid the problem getting worse, and then starting to eat the problems slowly. It's the usual thing of how do you eat the elephant? Well, it's actually one bite at a time, and the size of the elephant can be really scary, but it's having the support to recognize that it is a long-term requirement for the organization, and getting that senior management buy-in that this is something that does need to be addressed, and the benefits, if you achieve a solid framework, are actually really worthwhile. So there is still optimism to be had, even though I said in my opening statements that the challenges haven't really changed over the last 25 years. And I suspect the challenges won't change a great deal over the next 25 either.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. Any additional comments, Peter, Richard?
No, just say thank you to everyone for attending today.
Indeed, and I hope we've given you some ideas to take forward in your own experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.